I don't really want to stand up that high above you. I was trying to think how I could start today, and what comes to my mind is I'm honored and privileged to be here, and I think that's so trite. But when I reflected on it, I now know why speakers always say that. Because first of all, I'm honored that you would think I had something to say and to share with you here today, particularly the organizers. But it's also a privilege to spend time and to kind of feel the pulse of Irish child and youth care. It's a big privilege to have this opportunity. So I guess cliches sometimes have a place. And I do also want to thank John Digney. Where is you? Are you sitting over here somewhere, John? No? He's at the back. So I understand that John and Eamon, is Eamon sitting here somewhere? Eamon's over here. and Morris. So the three of those, I gather, are the ones who really have done a lot of the organizing, or if not all the organizing, for today. So thanks so much for that. I'm going to have to make sure I know how to work this. There are a couple of other things I wanted to say, and I made some notes, because I'm not just doing something I've always done before, I'm adding a bit new. So there's something old and something new for those of you who may have heard me speak before. I know a few people have said they heard me in either Belfast or Glasgow or somewhere like that in the last little bit of time. I guess the main thing I want to say is that I was really impressed, first of all, by the title of this, I was going to say symposium, seminar, gathering, meeting, conference. Unity through relationship. And I don't think I realized it was the title for the series, that this is the second time you've had a unity through relationship. I am going to talk a little bit about the notion of unity. And congruent care, of course, which is close to my heart, and theory, dialogue, and practice. I thought it was brilliant that the dialogue was put right in the middle between theory and practice. And I understand it was Morris who actually came up with the title, so I have to give you full credit. I'm going to do my best to try and do justice to the title for today. Let me see if there's anything. I was going to say a lot of things, but I won't say everything. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about theory. Some new thoughts I've had since actually being exposed to this conference. And actually I read through all the descriptions of the various workshops, and there's a lot of rich material over the next 3 days. On the practice. So I thought I could emphasize a little more the theory part, because I don't see a lot of people doing a lot of in-depth on theory, although people are mentioning theory. So, without further ado, it did that last time I did. There we go. So there's a notion, I don't know if you've ever heard of the work of, just a minute here, Chris Ardress. Chris Ardress was an organizational theorist. He only died in 2013. But he was very influential in North America. I'm not sure. I think around the world. Has anybody ever heard of Chris Ardress before? You'd have to be an organizational analyst probably to know him. But he actually had a huge influence on Peter Senge, who actually came up with the learning organization material and notion. So Chris Ardress I read many, many years ago. And he had a book called Theory and Practice, and he put out the notion that we all actually have a theory in use. That was his term. Or a mental model that we carry with us that guides us in how we make decisions in our work. So, I've said that. And whether or not it's coherent or articulate or intentional or consistent, we do have these models. So I think the first thing that I say to people who say, why do we need to talk about theory, is that you have a theory. Maybe it's helpful to actually reflect on that and to take a good look at where it came from and whether it's actually the most functional that you could have. Looking at the conference title, Unity Through Relationship, it triggered my whole, I dabble occasionally in sort of some of the modern science literature, and not so modern. I mean, unified field theory was a term invented by Einstein. So Einstein had tried all his life to come up with a unified theory for physics. And what led to this was Maxwell brought together magnetism and electric forces into one theory of electromagnetism, as far as I understand it. And what Einstein did was talk about gravity, and he kept trying to bring these two areas together into one theory. Can we find a way of explaining all of these things within the same theoretical framework? And he wasn't able to achieve that. And nobody has, to the satisfaction of all scientists. So what it led me to think was, would it be even thinkable to try and come up with a unified theory of child and youth work? In other words, something that helps us understand all the forces and elements that take place in the day-to-day work of child and youth care, bringing together the knowledge and practices into some kind of more congruent form. Just a question. But there are a few things that I did learn from particle physics which might apply to this pursuit. Nobody's been able to achieve a unified theory in particle physics, but that hasn't stopped people from trying. And what it's led to is the discovery of new particles, bosons. The Higgs boson is one of the newest ones. It's also led to the discovery of new planets, because the theory implies there are things that we haven't yet discovered that we need to look for. Might be useful if we had that notion in child and youth care. Are there things we haven't talked about in doing care work that maybe we should? And maybe a good theory could lead us to see some of those gaps. The other thing that a theoretical search can do is to help us try and deal with the contradictions within our work. And heaven knows there are huge... I'm dying to read your book, Morris, because I'm sure you get into looking at the systems of child welfare and social welfare, as well as the practice of social care. And there are huge contradictions in there right now. In fact, for most of us in the field, we love the kids, but it's the systems that often drive us crazy, right? It's trying to figure out how to get the system to adjust to do what the children need. And the other thing I learned from looking at this search for the theory of everything, or the unified field theory, is that an incomplete theory can still be very useful. It can still help you organize, even if it's not a totally developed theory. So, it's just a question. We may never achieve a unified theory, but is the pursuit of such a framework even something that we should be thinking about? Now, if you just think this is something that I'm just being fantastical about, or just playing with, the late great Henry Mayer quotes Al Trishman, who of course was the lead author in The Other 23 Hours, which is one of our North American classics, and maybe you've read it yourself. And he says the problem for the child care worker and the program administrator alike is to achieve some sort of integrative focus, what Al Trishman called a unifying something, as a basis for building a coherent helping environment for professional child care work. So this is over 50 years ago. Al Trishman was thinking about, is there a unifying something that we need to actually articulate and pay attention to that would help guide the work of child and youth care? So maybe I'm not the first one to think about a unifying framework. Al Trishman seems to have been on that track. And I stole that little logo from the soccer ball from the World Cup. I've also been thinking a lot about how do we actually define child and youth care work. I did an article like 25 years ago, which I don't believe in anymore. I want to rewrite at some point soon. But we can sum up child and youth care in a word, and if it was a word, it would probably be relationship for a lot of people. You hear people ever heard anybody say it's all about relationship? It's not only in child care we say that. They say that used car salesmen know that. Yeah? If you're going to sell cars, it's all about relationship. So maybe that's not enough to be a full theory of child and youth care. So I tried to do it in one sentence. The uniqueness of child and youth care could be summed up as how we share ourself, in care interactions, in the life space of young people and families, to create transformative developmental and therapeutic experiences. That's about as small as I can make a definition of child and youth care in one sentence. And if you look at that, the who, what, where, when, and why is all there. Just very basic. But it does cover those bases. And I think each of those notions, and I know there are workshops on care interactions happening in the next 2 days, our use of self. I don't like the term use of self so much. I talk about the sharing of self. Life space is a whole notion that needs a lot more work. And what do we mean by transformative development or transformative experiences? Tom, of course, is talking a lot about meaningful moments, and I think gets very close to a good unpacking of all of this. But it also occurs to me that you could write an article about what child and youth care means, or how it works, or what its definition is, or a theory of child and youth care in one article, or one book, or a career, like the late, great Mark Kruger. Actually, if you look at his career and all the things he wrote and thought, there is a definition of child and youth care there that he lived. And maybe we should be looking at a unified theory just for fun. So that's just a preamble to the fact that about in the middle of the 1980s, I found myself in a position of having a leave from the university to do research. I'd completed the projects that I'd committed to before, and I had a chance to think of something new. So what I decided to do was to go back and look at residential care, because I started out as a residential care worker with no experience with kids, with no training in child and youth care. Just found myself on the floor of a mental health center trying to figure out what to do. I then went and started a group home a couple of years later for 6 kids. I did the best I could, but I'm not sure I really knew what I was doing. So I thought, I need to find a theory of residential care to help me understand how good residential care should work. And I couldn't find a single theory. Actually, I did find one. And the one theory I found was done by an Israeli called Yochanan Vossner. But the theory was so complicated, I couldn't understand it. And he invented his own words and language, and he had principles and rules. And I talked to some of my Israeli colleagues, and I said, does anybody use this? And they said, oh. He said, you know, he got a ton of money to develop that, and nobody's ever done anything with it because they can't figure out how to use it. So I thought maybe there's room for a good theoretical framework for what makes residential care work, because I couldn't find one. And what I ended up doing was selecting 10 group care programs that were considered well-functioning by people who'd worked in the field for many years. I didn't ask them why necessarily they thought they were good programs. I would just, if 2 or 3 people said this is a really good program, or this is the best residential program in our region, I would trust that and then go and try and find out what it was doing. 10 programs, they range from 4 to 14 beds each, ages 10 to 17 in there. 14 months of, I would drop in any time of day or night. I had permission from all 10 programs to drop in any time, day or night. Usually if I came in the evening, I'd bring a dessert for dinner just so I wasn't just a parasite. I'd come to the door and say, oh, Jim's here, you know, and that was what I wanted. I was just part of the furniture after I walked through the door. I would come at breakfast time, wake up times. I'd go on outings, trips. I'd be there when parents were visiting, just kind of there as much as I could be. I ended up doing 85 formal interviews, countless informal conversations, sat in on shift changes, supervisory sessions, people just kind of opened their door to me. And 18 residents or former residents of these programs. So anything that I'm telling you isn't my brilliance. Anything I'm telling you is what I learned from the people who opened their doors and those kids who were willing to sit down and talk with me. And I'm very grateful for that. So the purpose of the study was to try and develop a theoretical framework. I say theoretical framework. I actually was trying to develop a theory of residential care. That's what the method I was using is all about. But I just never quite felt right saying that it's a full theory. It's more a framework, which hopefully can be further developed. and what makes a good or well-functioning group home, because all the programs I was studying, except one, were actually group homes. One was actually more of an experiential outdoor education model for young offenders. So the method I used was grounded theory, and some of you may know about grounded theory. Most people who start to do a grounded theory don't do a grounded theory because it's really difficult to do. However, I learned to trust the method and to stick with it. The trouble with grounded theory is it always takes a lot longer than you think it's going to take. But it is, I have a lot of good things to say about it. And if you're interested, these slides will be available, I gather. You can put them on the website, so you don't need to make any notes if you're interested. So I used the grounded theory method. And by the way, I put these wonderful photographs of kids because all around the world there are these wonderful young people who need child and youth care. Kurt Lewin is famous for saying there's nothing so practical as a good theory, and I deeply, deeply believe this. As I say, I don't think any of us function without a theory, framework for guiding our actions with children, with our colleagues, in our day-to-day lives. We all have theories in use. And Kurt Lewin said there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And heaven knows that child and youth care has been full of inappropriate theories over the last 80 years. We started with a lot of psychoanalytical stuff, which was useful. And then we went in North America, we had a lot of behavioral stuff, which has its uses. And we had Glasser's reality therapy, which has its points. Every theoretical approach has some good things to offer. But none of them in themselves, for me, was a full and useful theory to use in residential care. You always had to do a tremendous amount of adaptation and rethinking and redesigning. And so I tried to set out to come up with a theory that, as Barney Glaser would say, fits, works, and is relevant. I think that's what workers in the field are looking for, is if they had a theory that actually fits what I'm doing, it works on the floor, and it's relevant to my day-to-day practice, I think they would buy in. But too often the theories are imported from somewhere else, and they don't necessarily seem to fit the reality. So that's what a good grounded theory should be. The last thing, or one of the last things I want to say about theory, it's just a way of thinking about the world. That's the way I think about it, anyway. Whoops. And I think it's the most underrated skill in child and youth care. So if you see a list of child and youth care competencies, you don't often say good, clear thinking on that list. But I really think that is one of the most critical, and we overlook it, I think, at our peril. And near the end of the talk, I'll come back to this notion, because there is some very interesting research that we can now draw on, which I think can help us understand this better. I always like to have at least one quote from Albert Einstein. It makes me feel more intelligent to have a quote from Albert Einstein in my presentation, you know. And of course, I don't read Albert Einstein every night, but I have a book of quotable quotes, you know, quotes by Einstein. That's what most people do, is they just look through and find something relevant. Anyway, but this is very relevant. I think what you want is a theory that's simple as possible, but not too simple. So that's what I tried to do in the work that I did. The other part of it is that the only reason I could do it with confidence it would work is that I believed, and Lewin didn't say this, but there's nothing so theoretical as good practice. So if you find practitioners who are doing really good work with young people, and the young people are turning around, heading in a better direction, they're dealing with their trauma, they're reconnecting with family and peers and their school or whatever, then my sense is if we can go in and find out how they do that, that we can then create a good theory out of that, good practice. So that was the reason I tried to pick 10 well-functioning homes, is that I thought if I could understand how they were well-functioning and how they did it, and what we could learn from that, that then we could create a theory which we could have some confidence in, because it's grounded in good practice. And the other piece of this is, of course, much of residential work has traditionally been tacit knowing or implicit knowledge. Many of the best workers I worked with in my first 5 years of practice that I learned a lot from could not articulate to me how they did what they did. Right? I would ask them a question, and they would say, well, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. They'd have to work at unpacking how they actually perceived the dynamics they were seeing and how they chose to intervene when they did and how they did. It just kind of seemed intuitive to them. Because over years, they had learned to see patterns, they'd learned to interpret behavior, they'd learned what they could do that would make a difference. And I had to scramble to try and unpack that and to try and watch them and try and figure out how they did things. One of the workers that I never forgotten is George Jolly. He worked in my very first shift I worked with him. And he was this young black guy from the streets of Chicago. He didn't have a degree, but they hired him on the condition he would start his degree because he was one of the best youth workers I ever saw. And I think the director saw that, and they broke the rules, they hired this guy, and he taught us all how to deal with these tough young kids. He just kind of knew how to do it. And after shift, I'd say, George, can I take you out for a beer? I need to know why you did what you did and how you do it. How did you know this kid needed that at that time? I didn't have a clue of what was going on. So a lot of residential work is there, and is happening in a good way, but do we know how to articulate it? Can we share it with other people? Can we actually help people learn how to do that, rather than just say some workers are great and others are not? So the central element in a grounded theory is a core theme or variable or problematic, and frequently it's a psychosocial process, which simply means it involves the individual functioning within the collective functioning. So you're looking at that psychosocial dynamic. That's often what is at the heart of understanding parts of our social world. And of course, residential care is a social world. And the core theme that I discovered, and this took like 14 months before I actually figured out what the core theme was, is the struggle for congruence in service of the children's best interests. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to unpack, because congruent care is in the title of the conference. So I take that as permission to explore congruence, because for me it's one of the most important constructs in our field. And I'm not the first one to discover congruence. There are books that have been written before, but I have never seen anybody develop the notion of congruence or analyze it in any detail. So, congruence means that core values and principles are evident in action within each level and across all levels of the organization. And in my research, everybody, from the managers and the funders to the kids and their families, understood there were 5 levels. It's no mystery to the kids how we work. In fact, they know better than we do how we work. So, the top level is the extra agency level. These are the funders, the people who place kids in your program, the ones who write the policies about how you should do your work. That is a really important level, but it's extra agency. And then you have the management level, which are the people who are charged with actually creating these organizations, managing these organizations, making sure they work on a daily basis. And then we have the supervisory level, the people who are between the line workers and the managers, who I think have probably the most critical role of all, because they're the only ones who see down to the client and up to the extra agency issues. So they have a critical role to play. If I were going to start a dynamite residential program, the first thing I would look for is the best supervisor in the country, because you can build around that person. You can add the management, you can hire the workers. That is going to be the glue for your program. So those 5 levels, the kids know who makes decisions at which level. They know who is extra agency. I have to go to my social worker for that. Or I'm not going to talk to you because the manager can overrule you on that, so I'm going to go straight to the manager. They know this kind of dynamic. So congruence means that all of these 5 levels are working according to the same values and principles. Now, you can have congruence for very bad outcomes. You can have congruence for budget reduction. You can have congruence for lots of things. But you remember, it's in the best interest of the child. So the programs that I visited who were working well would always come back to say, okay, you'd like to change the shift patterns because you're not having a good enough social life. So you'd like to change the way we've organized the shifts. Well, a good supervisor would say, I understand that. How do you think this will impact on the kids? Rather than making the decision on what was easier or more favored by the staff, they would ask the staff to join with them to say, is this in the interest of the children we're working with? And often they would decide, no, actually, I see what you're saying. That wouldn't be very good for the kids. It wouldn't have enough continuity. It would kind of get in the way of relationships. So good programs, a good supervisor or manager is always coming back to, how would this affect this child or that child or the children in care? I also discovered there's what I called a flow of congruence from the top to the bottom. Maybe not a surprise. We all hope that if you train workers really well, that they can transform the organization from the bottom up. Well, that wasn't what I discovered. That the head of the home has the power and the ability to shape everything that happens, or to undermine, or to whatever. And the team at the head of an organization, I think this is probably true of every organization, I certainly experienced it at a university, that what they believe and how they act amongst themselves, not just what they say, but how they act and how they behave and what they believe deeply, actually filters down through the organization. And in the book that I wrote in 2002, I give an example of somebody who had a sort of not quite social learning, but a focus on child learning. And you could see the language and the behaviors right down to the kids. The kids learned and used the language. Sorry, I know it's a little bit loud. They used the language that the head of the home used in a modified way. And I also could have done that for the attachment-based models, for the more behavioral models. You could just trace right through the organization that ethos. So the flow of congruence is really critical to pay attention to. And the other thing that I came to understand is that we never get there. You never sort of reach the point where you're totally congruent. It's a struggle for congruence. And maybe it's just like life, right? It's a struggle until it's over. That was a lovely note to kind of... Should we take a break now? Actually, John said something, or Morris, you said something this morning. What did you say to me? Oh yeah, he said, if you come to an end more quickly than you think. I thought, I'm not going to die this morning. Anyway, it sounded rather ominous. So congruence, I think, is a really critical notion to understand, and we'll come back to that a bit as we go. But what does it really mean to act in the child's best interest? Everyone thinks they're acting in the best interest of the children, but I think if we're really honest with ourselves, we would have to admit that that doesn't always happen, or at least not consistently. I went and did a little research on the best interest of the child, and the earliest reference I could find to the interests of the child was August Eichhorn, and his book was published in 1925 in German, and it was then translated into English and published in 1935. So generally, I think, I'm looking at Tom here, we generally consider this to be the first book on residential care in North America. I don't know if you found anything earlier, Tom, but August Eichhorn's book, it's 90 years old. And it's interesting who wrote the foreword, Sigmund Freud. So you can see the theoretical orientation behind this. But he was a brilliant child care worker. Obviously, when you read the book, he is so sensitive to kids, and he's dealing with them in a very humane way, not just purely as libidos or other forces. He actually understood kids, I think, really well. And he talked about what's in the interests of the children. And then, of course, we have the UN Convention Article 3.1, which says, in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private, social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interest of the child shall be primary. And most legislation around the world, in the Western countries anyway, and the European countries, has the best interest of the child in it. Do you have it in your Irish legislation? Yeah, I would expect so. So at least that, my own study confirmed that that is the touchstone. And what it does, if you really take the best interest seriously, is it takes away the power struggles. So if you make decisions according to who has the most authority, the most influence, you can get into power struggles, right, between the manager and the supervisor, or the supervisor and the worker. But if you take the best interest as the touchstone, then the question isn't, is it my way or your way? Is how does what you want to do meet the interests of these children? And then I'll tell you how what I think we should do is in the best interest of the children. And when you take it to that level, it totally removes the power struggle and about who's going to win or lose. And you're both talking about how to address the needs of the children. So in the healthy programs, you could see that happening. And they didn't even use necessarily the terms best interest. They'd say, so what do you think, Ahmed needs from us today? I mean, he's obviously, his pain is right there on the surface. What do we need to do for him today? Or I'm feeling like the kids are getting a little bit anxious about Christmas coming. What should we do for the kids right now? Rather than, here's what I think we should do, or what do you think? It was, what's in their interest? What do they need from us? In many, many different ways. Hopefully I'll have a little bit of time before the end we can talk about this, but I think it might be better if I go through all of this before we get into discussion, because I'm sure I'm raising issues in your mind, and you may disagree with me, and that's fine. So full congruence is an ideal state. I don't think we ever reach it. In fact, I would say the most recent research that I've been involved in on the implementation of therapeutic residential care, taking a principle-based approach and evaluating it rigorously, something in the order of 85%, maybe 90% maybe of the time, we might actually be able to act in the best interest of the child. That's probably about the best we can do, because there are other things that happen that we have no control over. So there are financial constraints, referring agencies' needs, staff convenience and preferences, rules and procedures, control, filling beds. You know about all these things, right? But I think a healthy, strong program can begin to challenge some of the decisions being made on this basis and saying, wait a minute, I understand that you think we need to do that, but this is not in the best interest of the children, is it? Let's be honest about it. How can we do better to meet the needs of these children than what you're suggesting by cutting more money or changing this or putting a new rule in place? So what a lot of programs do who start taking this kind of notion of congruence and working according to values and principles in the best interest of the child, what they start doing is realizing they sometimes have way too many rules that they don't need. And they only have rules for safety issues, and they begin to talk about expectations. So what's the difference between a rule and an expectation? If you have a rule and a kid breaks it, you have to do something to him, or else it's not a rule. If you have an expectation, maybe the expectation was inappropriate, or maybe you need to change your expectation, or maybe you just simply express the fact that you're disappointed. I thought we'd had an agreement here, and I'm disappointed that you didn't follow through. That's far more powerful than punishing or consequencing if you have a strong relationship with that child. So that's the difference it makes, I think, to have this kind of approach. The other thing which you all know about, of course, is the pain that these kids are in. But I wasn't prepared when I went to do this research to find 100% of the kids in deep and profound pain. We are very good at glossing over this in our field. We have been in the past. But I even coined the term pain-based behavior because people were just not noticing that actually breaking that window has to do with pain. Swearing at you, cursing at you, had to do with pain. Getting into a fight with the kids in the playground had to do with pain. So in order to get that point, I had to say, this is really pain-based behavior. And it's actually, proven to be fairly useful for people trying to get staff to understand that it's not about you, right? When the kids throw a chair at you, it's not about you. It's about their pain. And how do you get past the chair to actually address the pain? That's it. And I know Tom's talking about this more. How do you get behind the behavior? That's really what it's about. And, there are even books over here. Larry Brenshaw's got a couple of books using troubled and troubling. Some of our classic books use the term troubling or troubled children. And I just think we've been glossing over the pain too much. Not that people didn't know it was there, but we weren't naming it. And I think if you don't name something, it can disappear. So, acting out behavior, a lot of people talk about, the kid's just acting out. Okay, what is he acting out? Where is that coming from? It's not okay to just label it acting out. And of course, we used to talk about behavior management, controlling children's behavior. In fact, Tom will remember the days when we started teaching where this was the definition of child and youth care. It's managing children's behavior is the core function of child and youth care workers. That was in a lot of texts. And I think we're now realizing it's not about controlling behavior. It's actually about creating experiences. Kids are in charge of their own behavior, right? We kid ourselves if we think we're ever in control. We can influence kids, but they're in control of their own behavior. So how do we influence them to actually act more in accordance with their own best interests? So when I went back and started to look at the literature, I thought, well, of course, because all of the newsletters that kids write from group homes, the poetry you find in group homes or group care, any newsletters, it's all about pain. And the first book published in Canada by Youth in Care, former Youth in Care, was called Pain, Lots of Pain. Hello, right? We just weren't getting it in terms of talking about the pain. And of course, I don't know if you know Leonard Davies' book, but this is a brilliant little book. Articles that he wrote for Social Care or Community Care, one of those journals. Rivers of Pain, Bridges of Hope. Okay, that names it pretty well. So in my own book, I had to make pain the first. It's an awkward title, I agree. Larry Brenshaw makes fun of this every time he talks. He said, you should have called your book Pain-Based Behavior. And I said, well, I had to make the first, I had to get other notions in there. So maybe it's not a great title, but I had to honor the fact that it was the kids' pain that was front and center in all of the programs that I was studying. Also, it's called Reinterpreting Residential Care for Children and Youth. My next book is going to be on implementing residential care with children and youth. So I think I missed an important point in the title there. So where does the pain come from? Well, I don't have to tell you, you know this. All kinds of childhood experiences and earlier experience. Even just being removed from your home and placed in a group care setting is a traumatic experience. But there are usually many more. And the one that I think is often overlooked is the losses. I think about 50% of the young people I talked to had had a major loss in their life in the previous 2 years. A parent or a sibling or a friend or an uncle, somebody close to them had died. And in many cases, they had yet to process it. Well, that's going to cause problems. If you have a serious attachment that you lose, and you don't have a chance to work that through. That's going to inhibit your ability to attach in the future. So, in brief, pain is the ongoing result of trauma. Now, we all are talking about trauma these days, but it's only back in the 1980s that childhood trauma was discovered. I don't think you'll find a reference to childhood trauma before the 1980s. And it came out of the Vietnam War, when they began to notice post-traumatic stress disorder. They labeled it post-traumatic stress disorder, what used to be called shell shock or those kinds of things. And I think it was Sandra Bloom who developed the sanctuary model, who moved from working with adults to working with children. And she said, I'm seeing the same symptoms. I'm seeing the same behaviors that I saw with traumatized war veterans. So she was one of the first people to say, maybe what we're seeing is trauma, the results of trauma. So as I was studying group homes and seeing pain, I didn't know anything about the trauma literature at that point. But when I went back to look at the literature, I discovered that there was this parallel stream of research going on around trauma. So we're just looking at two sides of the same coin, right? So pain is the effect of trauma. It's interesting actually to look at the history of evolution, just as a bit of a sidebar. When I first started in the field, they were talking about the battered child syndrome. Do you ever, any of the oldies here? So they're struggling with that, and then we discovered that there was something called child abuse happening. Then came along incest. Gosh, we found some cases of incest. Or the seductive child. Gosh, some of these children lead adults to sexually abuse them, right? I mean, what an inadequate framework that was. But there were articles on the seductive child. Then we said, wait a minute, this is sexual abuse. So these notions develop, and now we're in identifying trauma. And I thought, okay, what's the next big thing that we're missing right now? Do you have any ideas what it might be? In 10 years, they'll look back and say, gosh, we didn't even know that was happening. The best candidate I can come up with is something like screen addiction. All right? I see it at the university. When I walk across campus between classes, I would say 1/3 of every person on the campus is on a screen. They're not even looking at the people around them. They're bumping into them and walking around them. They're on their screens. Now, maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it is. Are we getting into virtual relationships that we don't really understand? Are kids developing virtual relationships, whereas we talked about face-to-face relationships in the olden days? I don't know, but it's something to think about. So the bottom line is residential workers especially work in cultures of pain. I'm going to show you some evidence later, which I think helps point to the fact that I think most of the critical incidents in residential care are triggered by staff reactions to children's pain-based behaviors. So if we can change from reacting to children's behaviors to responding in a more therapeutic way, it can make a dramatic difference. And I'll show you just some beginning research on that. So the mix of children's pain and pain-based behaviors and adult caregivers' reactivity is a recipe for confrontation, power struggles, and abuse. And I think you probably all know of situations, I know them from my early practice, where unnecessary abusive situations were created by the staff not knowing how to respond to these kids in an effective way. I think we've got to be very honest about that. So we need to respond to their pain, not simply react. Whoops. And I think the difference, just for thinking it through to explain this to students or to workers, to react is to act on the basis of my feelings, my perceptions, me, how your behavior affects me. Don't talk to me like that, I'm a staff member. Right? So getting into that, it's about me. You could have killed me with that chair. I'm going to lock you up for the next 2 hours or 3 hours. I'm going to put you in confinement, or I'm going to hold you down. Rather than responding, which is, so what does throwing that chair mean about what this kid is experiencing right now, and what does that mean about how I need to respond to his needs? It's a very different orientation, but you have to have an intent. You have to have some way of understanding that behavior. That this isn't about you, it's pain-based behavior, and how do I help this kid in this situation learn something about themselves? Maybe begin to move towards some self-regulation. How is this an opportunity for that? So a good worker isn't thinking about him or herself in moments like that. They're thinking, what does this child need right now? What's going on with this child? How do I respond in a therapeutic way rather than a punitive way? So those are the major differences there, and they're quite profound in their impact on children, we're finding, in implementing different approaches. And the thing I think we have to remember is all of our workers and ourselves are also experiencing this, right? It triggers our pain. Most of us have pains of various kinds. We have things that happened in our own childhoods or in our own families or in our own extended families. Or there's certain things that just get under our skin very easily or very quickly. So we have to do a lot of work on ourselves in order to be able to cope with this culture of pain that we're living in and working in. And I had to pick up on the word dialogue, which I think was brilliant, Morris, because it is only through dialogue that we begin to shift our ways of thinking and responding to kids. So whether it's in education and training, a program at a university, a college, a training program, a workshop, orientation, when people come to work in your organization, do they have a framework for what it is you're about, what you believe, what you value, what you don't do? Planning and anticipation. There's a lot of discussion in good programs about this new kid's coming in. We're going to spend a week trying to understand what's going on. Then we're going to have a meeting to figure out how we can help this child the best way possible. A lot of proactive work. Supervision, of course, being absolutely critical, as I've said. Team meetings, shift changes. You don't just talk about your weekend the next week and you don't just gossip about what happened before. You're actually thinking through your therapeutic principles and how are you applying them. How did you blow it this morning and what needs to be done to respond better. Debriefing incidents that happen, critical. And conferences and workshops like this. I think just picking up one new good idea that you can take back and share with your staff or that you can use yourself makes this kind of thing worthwhile. There is a paradox at the heart of group care. And the way I would say it is a group home is not a normal or natural setting for anybody. However, the residents, the young people, are able to develop a sense of normality by living in a good group care program. So this isn't something intuitive. A lot of people say kids should not be in residences because they should be in families and they're always bad. Residential care is always bad and we should shut it down. And if we can't shut it down, let's make it as small as possible. It's minimal. My research says quite the opposite. A really good residential program can help some young people turn around much more quickly than any other intervention. And I had one child who had been through 32 foster homes in 6 years. And I have a slide that I usually put up which says, 32 foster homes in 6 years. Who's the slow learner here? Right? She was extremely successful in what she did. She broke down every single foster home within months. Because that isn't what I want. That's not what I need. Help. So she was placed in a really good, one of the programs I studied, she was placed in there. Within 3 months, her life was changing, was turning around. And you know what it was, right? It was a relationship. So the director of that program, she did an overdose. The cops phoned, police phoned and said, we've picked up so-and-so, they knew her, and we're taking her to the hospital because she's unconscious. When I talked to her, she told me the story. I said, what made the difference? Because you're obviously living a very different life now. By the way, she's now working for that same agency doing great work. So she was having a baby when I met her, and she was off drugs, off alcohol, and living with a child care worker as a kind of therapeutic foster person. And I thought, this kid is going to be okay. And her child is going to be okay. Because she has learned so much through this experience. So what it was, she said, when I came out of my coma or whatever it was, she said, the head of the group home was sitting beside me, Paul. And the staff told me Paul was there before I got there. So this is like 48 hours later, he never left her bedside. And she said to me, that's when I knew this place was not going to let me go. And I stopped fighting. That's what a really good group program can do, is you just surround that child with a safe, caring environment, and you demonstrate that through your actions. She got the message, and her life has dramatically changed. Why did we have to go through 32 foster placements to figure that out? That's my question. It's because we don't value good residential care. We don't understand its place in the system of care. And that some kids need it right away, not after 30 or 20 foster placements that don't work. Anyway, that's my ranting. So, the experience of normality includes all kinds of things. And you can see in this list probably most of the things you've read about child and youth care somewhere. Whether it's Larry Brentrow's work, Reclaiming Youth at Risk, whether it's John Sita's book on In Whose Best Interest, whether it's Henry Mayer's work on developmental group care. Most of what we're talking about is creating opportunities for kids to regain a sense of belonging, or to gain, maybe for the first time, a sense of dignity, self-worth, meaning. You can read the list. These are the experiences that we need to create for young people. Became very clear in the research that I was doing. I know that there are some things written about don't bring up your kids to be normal, and Jerry Fuster's work. He's got a book about don't bring your kids up to be normal. Well, I think that's a different context. No, we don't want our kids to be automatons. We don't want to bring them up to just slavishly fit into the capitalist economy. But at the same time, these kids, more than anything, want to feel they have a place in the community, that they're valued. That's what we mean by a sense of normality, that they are valued and they have a place, and they're not just problems. And that's the message they have, right? Is they're a big problem. So, this is the last piece of the framework I'm going to put up. I analyzed every single positive change that I could record over 14 months in 10 programs. So I listened to people, I sat in on meetings, I interviewed people, and I recorded every single positive change that was discussed or seen or mentioned at all. At any level. That could be even at the ministry level, where a worker changed their understanding of the home, changed how they reacted to the children they placed in the home, or a manager, how he changed or she changed how they dealt with their staff or their policies, or the supervisors, or the line workers, or the children and their families. How parents saw their child differently, what parents were doing differently after being involved with the group care program. So there were hundreds of these, okay, over 14 months. And then I sat down and said, okay, what is it that led to this change? And it all reduced to 11 dynamics. Every one of those changes had one or more of these dynamics at play, which I found quite amazing. So I have a lot of faith that if a program is doing these 11 things, you have a healthy program. Because these are the things that bring about positive change. So I'll go through it fairly quickly, but so listening and responding with respect. And it helps young people develop a sense of dignity, being valued, persons who have a sense of worth. See how this applies at every level of the organization? If workers are responded to with, and listened to and responded to with respect, they will develop a sense of being worthy. They will develop a sense of being valued. It works at every level. That's the congruence. Communicating a framework for understanding. Young people need to know why they're there. I'm interviewing young people, actually one of my graduate students right now, I'm reading the transcripts, is interviewing 25 former youth in care. Do you know how many of them can tell you why they went into care? Not many. Now, maybe they were told and forgot, but it's not the kind of thing you forget, right? So we don't spend a lot of time helping kids understand why they're doing what they're doing, why we're there, why we're doing what we're doing. Workers need a framework. So what is it you want me to do? Just tell me and I'll do it, right? Workers need a framework. Everybody needs a framework. Building rapport and relationships, absolutely critical. We've talked about that already. Establishing structure, routine, and expectations. And you notice it doesn't say rules. And this was before I even thought about that issue. Somehow rules weren't what it was about. It was really expectations. Expectations are much more powerful, much more flexible, much more therapeutic than rules. I had one director admit to me that they had over 500 rules in their program. And she said, I'm ashamed to say this now because I now realize how ridiculous it is, but every time something happened we didn't have a rule for, we wrote a new rule. I think a lot of programs get trapped into that. Somehow we can solve the problem by coming up with another rule. Inspiring commitment, offering young people emotional and developmental support, challenging thinking and actions. These two go together. If we offer therapeutic support, developmental support, emotional support, then we've earned the right to challenge kids, right? What my mom used to say to me when I did something wrong is she'd say, Jim, or James P., that's not worthy of you. I've never forgotten that. She didn't say I was wrong. She said, that's not worthy of you. Which really communicated to me is I could do better. She had faith that I could do better. And she was right, of course. Mothers are always right. Sharing power in decision making. Again, if you go back to the pioneers in child and youth work, Korczak in Poland, he knew this 100 years ago and was acting on this. But we're still not doing it in a lot of our programs. Respecting the personal space and time of children. So a child's not ready to do something we want them to do. Instead of punishing them, do we say, when do you think you might be ready to do this? Right? You're just creating some space. You're respecting the fact that they're telling you, I'm not ready to do this right now. Makes a huge difference. We all know this, right? And the best way to get somebody to speak at a meeting is to tell them they don't have to speak. Right? I mean, I had the mother of one of our doctoral students come to a class that I asked the doctoral student to speak at. And I said, should I ask your mom to say a few words about it? And she said, oh, she'd kill me if you did. So the first thing I said to her was, you don't have to say anything, just come and enjoy the class. Well, at the end of the class, she started to talk. If I told her she had to talk, I'm not so sure she would have. So I think, respecting space and time is powerful. Discovering and uncovering potential. We can all think of people who saw more in us than we saw in ourselves, right? So at some point in your life, a teacher, a parent, an uncle, an aunt, a coach. I can't imagine you didn't have a few people who, in some way, believed that you could do things that you didn't even think you could do. And we need those kinds of people who believe in us. And the last one is just simply providing resources. We have to give kids things. We have to give them things like shoes. We have to give them they're going to play basketball, they need the Michael Jordan shoes or whatever it is that everybody else is wearing. We just somehow have to be generous with kids. And that's how they learn generosity, right? Is by that. And I'll tell you one quick story about that because we have a few minutes. This was the first group home I studied in my research. And it was a really, really good place. And by the way, how many of you ever heard of Barbara Kahan? Anybody here from the UK? Barbara Kahan? Barbara Kahan was the head of the Children's Bureau. She was president. She was also the head of the Oxfordshire Social Services. You must know Barbara Kahan's name, right? I'm looking at Mark Smith. Anyway, I met Barbara when she chaired a conference at the Kensington Town Hall like many, many, many years ago. She's passed away now. But Barbara was one of those fierce advocates. In fact, I used to sort of be afraid to spend a lot of time with her because I knew she would start challenging me to do more, right? She was just a fierce advocate for children. Anyway, she said to me, talking about quality programs, she said, if the program, Jim, is not good enough for your children, it's not good enough for anybody's children. And she's absolutely right. And when I went to visit programs in my study, a bottom line for me was if I wouldn't have allowed my children to go and live in that home for a period of time, I'm not saying they needed it, but I'm just thinking, would I have trusted my child to these staff for a period of time? I would. In a good program, I would feel okay. If there was a program I didn't feel I would leave my own child in, that was a signal there's something not working here. So I think each of us as experts in this field, as people who work and believe in these things, that is the bottom line. And if it's not working well enough for your own child to be there, then something needs to be changed. It's a high bar, but it is the right bar, isn't it? So Barbara used to always challenge people about this. In fact, one judge criticized her and said, the trouble with Barbara is she always takes the side of the child. And Barbara said, is that a criticism? She was always looking at the best interest of the child. It wasn't about what's easy for the program or what's cheaper or what's what's in government policy. It's what's in the interest of these children. So those 11 dynamics, I think, are really something we should keep an eye on. The other thing that has emerged just since doing my study is the importance of complexity. Now, this is an actual number that refers to something actual in life, and many of you will know the thing I'm talking about. Approximately 43 quintillion is the number. Do you know what that is? That's the number of combinations of a Rubik's Cube. How many of you have ever seen a Rubik's Cube? Quite a few of you. It used to drive me crazy to try and do that, right? There are 43 quintillion combinations. There's only 6 colors and 54 visible squares. But because of the way it can be turned, there are 43 quintillion combinations. That's quite amazing, isn't it? But what's the maximum number of changes it takes to get it back aligned? Or to be congruent, in my term. To align those things, no matter which combination it's in, of those 43 quintillion, what's the maximum number of changes it takes to realign it? I find this hard to believe. Whoops. 20. Okay, so 43 quintillion possible combinations, and it only takes 20 moves to get it back together if you know what you're doing. And the world record, I'm sorry to say it's not an Irish, it's a Scottish fellow, Brendan Valance, he averages 10.74 seconds. No matter which combination you give him, he averages just over 10 seconds to solve it. Now, this is a metaphor for complexity, right, in my way of thinking. Think back to a good theory. There's nothing more practical than a good theory. If you have a system for solving the cube and not just do it at random. If you did it at random, I mean, I went online just for fun. I found a Rubik's Cube website, and there was somebody who said, I've been trying it for 23 years, and I finally did it. 23 years it took somebody to actually realign those things. This guy can do it in 10 seconds. Why? Because he has a method. He has a framework, right? So I think this is a good analogy for why a good theory and a good framework, helping people focus on the differences that make a difference, right? Those 11 things are differences that make a difference for these kids. Out of all the millions of things you could do. So, and the reason I talk about the Rubik's Cube is that when I developed this model, the Rubik's Cube seemed to me the right image for what I was discovering. So you don't have to read this, but these are the 11 interactional dynamics, the 5 levels of a home, from extra agency down to the youth and family. These were 3 psychosocial processes, I called them, which one is just creating the extra familial home, what the manager has to do. Responding to pain and pain-based behavior is the core of what the workers need to learn how to do. And developing a sense of normality is what the children need to achieve. So you put those things together, and it kind of looked like a Rubik's Cube. And this is surrounded by congruence. If you can get congruence across all of these variables, I think you're going to have a good program. And do you know how many variables there are in there? Just by accident? 20. 20 variables. I don't know if there's some mystical meaning to 20, but only takes 20 moves to solve a Rubik's Cube, and there are 20 different dimensions here. I thought that was kind of neat, actually. So I'm going to end by just talking about what happens if you try and put a framework like this into place. So one of the groups that picked this up was Cornell University's residential childcare project, Martha Holden and her group. And just out of the blue one day, they emailed me and said, can we use your framework? Because it helps us pull together the research we've been doing on caring for kids. We'd like to put it together. So they developed what's called the CARE program model. And they have 6 principles that are at the heart of this program model. And I'm not pushing this as the model. There are many others. There's the sanctuary model, there's reclaiming youth models, there's all kinds of models. What I'm pushing for is a model. Staff need a way of making sense out of what they're expected to do. And so what Martha came up with was all the research over the last 60 to 80 years, all the writing in child and youth work leads to these 6 principles. So workers need to have a relationship. They need to know how to build good, strong relationships with children. They need to be developmentally focused, helping kids move to the next stage of their development. The zone of proximal development is a huge concept for a lot of workers now. Ask them to do a little more than they're doing, but not so much they can't be successful. How do you scaffold them to actually achieve more things? Family involved, clearly. They're going to go back to their families in 70% of the cases anyway, so how do we help them stay connected, no matter how dysfunctional that family might be? Competence-centered. They need to learn skills. They need to learn to self-regulate. Trauma-informed. Clearly, that's a newer one in the last 25 years. And ecologically oriented, the old Bronfenbrenner stuff. Actually, Bronfenbrenner learned almost everything he knows from Kurt Lewin, who said there's nothing so practical as a good theory. He was a student of Kurt Lewin, and he basically took Lewin's ideas one step further and popularized them. So everybody's learning from everybody here, but those 6 principles are pretty good candidates. And out of 70 people I interviewed in 7 different agencies, not one person disagreed that any of these principles were not important and appropriate. So if you can get 100% of your staff saying, yes, these are important, these are things we want to do, then your task is a lot easier, because then it's how do we do it, not whether we do it. So having a framework, I think, gets you really much further ahead. So putting a principle or value-based approach into practice requires staff to stop having to have technical solutions. And I know Mark's going to talk about techne versus phronesis in his talk. Don't miss it tomorrow. But we have in North America become much too technical and behaviorally focused. If a child does this, then you do that. If the child absconds, then they're grounded for 3 nights. Or if a child swears at a staff member, then they're in isolation for 2 hours. Or, all kinds of stuff, which is not therapeutic at all. It's not responding to the interest of the child. It's really responding to our needs to try and control. So you need staff to take a much more adaptive approach and say, what's going on here? What does this child need from me right now? Not what consequence do I impose because of that misbehavior. It's pain-based behavior, don't forget, right? 2 of the most common statements from staff about trying to implement this new way of thinking about programs, a principle-based approach, is it's about changing your mindset. It's thinking outside the box. It does take a lot more thinking, which has been undervalued, I think. If you want to learn more about what we're using in the CARE program to help agencies, is the research of Robert Keegan from Harvard University. And he's written a book called Immunity to Change. And he's researched for 35 or 40 years adult mindsets. And he's very, very clearly set out the difference between a mindset that is technical versus a mindset that can actually adapt to complexity. And I hope I've convinced you that child and youth care is complex, and residential care is complex. However, workers can be supported to develop the ability to respond to the complexity of having to make decisions in the moment, thinking through these principles. How do I actually respond? What we're really doing is creating a culture of care, a principle-based or a child's best interest-based culture. So what Cornell was asked to do originally by one of the states, South Carolina, was to develop a new training model for child care workers. But once they looked at the research and they looked at my research, they said, it isn't about training the line workers, it's about changing the agency. So in the care model, as with others, like Sanctuary, every single person in the agency goes through the same training. Whether you're a driver, a cook, a maintenance man, or the president, or a line worker, or a supervisor, or a manager, or an accountant, or a receptionist, they all go through the same training so that everybody is understanding what they're trying to achieve. So let me give you an example of the difference it makes. I went to this one program, and I'm going to show you some of their results in just a moment before I finish. The Waterford Country School in Connecticut has been one of the longest. It's been doing the care model for about 5.5 years. So, I'm talking to the maintenance man about his experience. And he says, Jim, I used to get really angry at the staff that they don't know how to control these kids. I mean, these kids would punch holes in the walls and I'd have to come in and fix them, right? And I got really fed up with this. Or they break windows. I mean, do you know how much money we spent replacing windows last year? He said, but then I went through this training and I suddenly realized actually these kids need to do that. These kids are getting out the pain that they have carried for years. God, if I got some of the pain out that I have, I'd probably go a little berserk for a while. And he said, I also learned that actually I can be part of the therapeutic team because I can go and connect with that kid when he settles down and say, come on, I'm going to show you how to fix this. So he saw his role as being part of the therapeutic program. And you could see how the cook would think the same thing, the drivers. How you relate to kids when you drive them to their medical appointments or to school in the morning will make a major difference to those kids and how their day is going to go. The person at the front desk, when somebody walks in, oh, I don't know what these workers are up to. I don't think they know what they're doing. It's so easy for someone to create a negative image. You've all been into organizations where somebody at the front desk kind of gives you the sense they don't respect what's going on there, whether it's a retail store or a bank or a hotel or whatever. So you want that's the person who's going to have the first contact with the parents when they come through the door. You want them to say, she'll be with you in a minute. She's dealing with something really important with one of the children. Time is up. So, quality residential care is a whole organizational process involving everybody. I'm just going to quickly show you, okay, very, very quickly here, less than a minute. This is residential restraints at the Waterford Country School. That's the point at which they implemented a therapeutic approach to working with kids. That's the average number of restraints, about 20 per 1,000 bed days. That's the trajectory they were on. Literally within 2 months after they implemented this new approach, the number of restraints dropped by 50%. And look at the difference in the volatility. This is the shelter program at the same place. Shelter restraints dropped by more than a half. This is something we didn't expect. Use of psychotropic medications. A lot of the medications kids are on are not for the kids, they're for the staff. The staff want the kids to be on medication to control them. When the staff are more competent, the kids don't need the medication so much. And here's just the final slide on this. Aggression towards staff, property destruction, and runaways. It got worse for the first few months as staff started to learn how to respond differently, and then it started to drop. Within 3 years, all those indicators had dropped by 50%. So, residential care should not be a last resort. It's not rocket science. It's actually far more complex than that. However, we are discovering ways to respond to that complexity with, I think, some really good outcomes. So, let the dialogue begin for the next 3 days. Thank you for listening.